So first of all, welcome to this webinar on how to build engaging user-facing analytics. My name is Robert Kosara. I'm a data viz developer here at Observable, and I've been in this data visualization world for 25 years at this point. And also my colleague Tom is in the background, who's able to answer questions and help with the webinar logistics here. And let's just get into what we're going to be talking about today. All right, so I will start out by sort of defining this idea of user-facing analytics a little bit and what we mean by that, and then I'll talk about the parts that or the things that you have to do, that you can do, that you should do to build a great experience for people. So we start with the overview dashboard, and we look into more deeper details that you want to add, the importance of context, especially when we're talking about user facing, meaning sort of external facing, people who aren't necessarily part of your organization, the importance of branding and design, and then speed for engagement, and also actually just to keep people in the flow and how to keep your data fresh. And then we'll have a bit of a Q&A at the end. And actually, I usually put the Q&A at the end of these of this list, but really what I'm hoping for is that there will be questions during the webinar. And so if you have any questions, just post them in the chat here, and I will keep an eye on it and answer them as they come up, if they make sense in context, because I don't want to have to wait until the very end. And I will try to actually stay on time, because usually we go a little bit too long, but my plan is to wrap up within about 30 minutes, or actually less than that, and then we will have a bit of time for Q&A at the end. All right, with that, what does user-facing mean in this context? So by user-facing, or the users we're talking about are people who are not inside your organization. So these are users of your products, of your services, that are not inside your immediate organization. Like you would usually think about in terms of, when you think about building a dashboard, you usually build that for somebody who's in the same organization. So they are much closer to you in the sense of like where they are organizationally. And I will talk about this a bit more. It's usually easier to get a sense of who they are, because that's a very important question, but I'll get to that in a second. So examples for this would be perhaps you're providing a service and you have metrics about those services. So my example is going to be Amazon Web Services. So AWS, they provide services that you pay for, and then they give you dashboards, and they give you a whole bunch of different like ways of seeing how your things are performing, what you're spending your money on, and so on. So this would be an example of a user-facing dashboard or a user-facing data app. Maybe there are devices that collect data. So maybe you're renting out equipment, and that equipment, I'm thinking of like industrial equipment kind of things where there's a lot of data being collected. There are things that are like long-term that do something for your customers, and they want to know how well are they working, are there any issues with servicing of them or whatever. And so you can provide that using analytics that you're providing. And sorry, actually I wanted to switch over my layout here to something a little bit more focused on the slide than on me. And then of course you could be a data broker. So maybe the data itself is the product. And so then you want to build something that is an app, a way to get to the data for your customers and give them access to that, and give them ways of consuming the product that you're selling them, which in this case is the data itself. And as I already said, this is usually for paying customers. So we're thinking about, and customers, I guess, in general, but usually people who pay for your services. I have a few examples of like banks, which of course your customers are also paying, but they're not necessarily paying specifically for the product that is the dashboard, or that is the analytics, but it's part of that. So you've got customers that are external and that are paying for your services or for your goods, and you're giving them this additional information. And I will talk about tasks and needs in on the next slide, I think, when I talk about users. But these are analytics need to be tailored to specific tasks and user needs as much as you can. This can be very difficult because it might be very hard to know what people actually do with that information. But that is what you really need to think about, because otherwise it's very difficult to design something that works for those customers. And usually I'm not talking about public-facing dashboards, even though some of the examples I'm going to show are public-facing, just because those are the examples that I can find. But usually we're not talking about generally public-facing stuff, which is a bit different, because if you're public-facing, you usually have no idea really who the users are. And there has to be a lot more context. But there will be some of that also kind of going into building user-facing analytics and user-facing data apps in general. Right. So the most important question, I think just for everything, anything that you build as a dashboard or data app is always going to be, who are your users? And this is trickier when these users are external, because you don't know them as well. You can't ask them as easily what they need, what they know, where they come from. So you obviously need to try to answer these sort of key questions, like what do they know about the data, about your services, about your products, sorry, and what do they need? So what are their tasks? What do they try to accomplish using your data app, using your dashboard? Give me a second, sorry. And I'm trying to make a distinction here between the kinds of users that you might have that are domain experts of something that they're using, versus people who know the data well or not know the data well. So they might know the domain, but not the data. They might not know the numbers, or they might not know how the data is being collected and like all the ins and outs of that. But they might be experts and very well versed in the domain, in what they are doing. But they also might be the other way around. There are people who know data really well, but don't know the domain as much. And so you want to figure out who are those people, what's their focus, and what can that tell you about what you want to build for them. And they may know both. I mean, obviously, this is very often the case. Very often you're dealing with people who know the data just as well as the domain. And it's important to at least try to understand their sort of mental model and their expectations. So they will have an idea of what you are trying to sort of like sell them or give them, and that might be different from the way you think about your services. So it's always an interesting sort of like exercise to say, well, what if I'm the user, if I'm the customer, what do I see of this company? What do I see of these services? And what do I want to do? And how do I make that work given the information that is being presented to me? And so to give you an example of this might all be a little bit abstract. So this is an example of an AWS dashboard. And I'd say that I was looking for those on the web. So these are sort of like random examples. But I think this one shows a good example of something that works that probably works as a dashboard, even though it's not the prettiest dashboard in the world, but it certainly is a functional dashboard that gives you a quick idea of what's happening. In this case, I think this is about S3, so this is data storage, and so it tells you, if I can point here, I think I can point, right? Can I? Apparently not. Okay. Anyway, but in the top left there, you can see this big number, which is about total storage in bytes, which you might argue you don't need it down to the single byte if you're talking about this is like 20 gigabytes of storage, but it gives you a number. And if you're expecting a number there and you know what the number should be and it's different, well, that gives you information that you might want to dig into this and see, well, what's happening. There's an object count because you're looking at both the total size and the amount of objects of files that are stored. number of accounts, and so on. And these just give you ideas of like, well, is this the correct number or not? It's probably, if it's a small number, that's probably what you expect. But if that number suddenly changes, well, maybe somebody else is using this that shouldn't be, or whatever. So you can get this quick bit of information from this that just helps you understand and make a decision whether to dig deeper. And that's really what these first sort of like quick dashboards are very useful for. And I'll get to this in a little bit again, because what I think is important here to think about is sort of like the process, the structure of like, what do people do with these data apps and dashboards? And for that, I want to use a quote that I like from Ben Schneiderman. This is kind of old now, but it's from the 90s. But I think it's still it's relevant here, and I use this a fair bit. But I think it's helpful just to kind of as a general overall framework of how to think about how to present data. And the quote goes, "Overview first, zoom and filter, then details on demand." And so this is from a paper by Ben Schneiderman from 96. But I think it's helpful to think in those terms. Like, you start with an overview, you start with the first kind of overall idea of, is everything all right? Are there things that we need to look at? And then you go deeper by zooming and filtering or whatever it is, and then giving people details on demand. And so with that, we want to start with the overview first. And so the overview dashboard is really important here, because a lot of users, and I think I have this on here somewhere, but I forget where I put this, but a lot of users are going to only want to use your dashboard, your data app, for a quick glance. And that's actually a good thing. If they can quickly get the information, then you've given them the thing that they need, and they don't have to waste time digging deeper. So what you do want to do for that is you want to show the key metrics in one place. So meaning the most important numbers, like you just saw on this AWS example, number of bytes, number of dollars. I have another example where it's the top line is cost, is spend. And so if you're looking for a spend, and it's a number, then this was going to tell you if are we where we should be, or are we spending more than we should, than we're expecting. And don't overload it with details, because that's actually a very common thing. And I will keep coming back to this a few times, because people like to build these like monolithic dashboards that have like everything on them. And I have an example, I think, of that. But I think it's really helpful to think about what are the tasks and what do you need to do first, and then where do I put more information. And so the use case here is getting a quick idea, quick look at the data. So if I want to just be able to basically glance at this and say, is everything as we expected? Great. Then I'm done with this dashboard for today or for this week or whatever, and I don't have to dig deeper. But what if there is something that's not going well? Then how do I get more information about that? So what parts of this are right? Which ones seem to be fine? Then I just, there's no need to waste time on them. But how do I get more information for those things that need a closer look? And if I need to take action, where do I go next? And also, it's important to understand or to think about, like, what would you show sort of different levels in a hierarchy in a company. So if your customers are going to ask about certain things and they're going to have to report to their C-level or whatever, then the executives, then they're going to see some of that information. And so giving them something that they can quickly look at is very helpful, because they can just like say, okay, yeah, I understand this. I don't need to see any details, but you're telling me this and I can see it right here in the numbers that things are as expected. Great. And if not, then they can ask questions and say, well, what about this? What about that? So having this sort of like executive summary is a very good thing in terms of having its own page, its own separate view of the data that doesn't try to throw everything at you. And so to do that, I think it's really important to think in terms of like a visual hierarchy. We have a couple of blog posts that talk about this, the importance of starting with. Usually, actually, it's a very straightforward way to do this, where you start with the sort of like the big numbers at the top, because a lot of people know what numbers they expect. Those can be pure numbers. They can be little charts that kind of help you illustrate what that is, and especially if you have like a reference that you compare to. And that just gives you the most important information at a glance. But also, you can use text. And this is something that I think people underappreciate because they think in terms of like, well, a dashboard is numbers. But really, you can do a lot by adding text to a data app or to a dashboard by putting things into headings of charts, for example. And I will talk about context a little later, especially when you're talking about users who are external, who aren't frequent users. So I'm trying to not call them casual users because that's not what they are, but they aren't necessarily frequent users of your product, of your dashboard, of your data app. And so for them, it's more important to know exactly what it is that they're looking at. And so having meaningful headings for individual charts, for sections of charts, is really important. And then there are sort of like this TLDR, too long didn't read, executive summaries, where you might want to put a summary paragraph at the top, or just a sentence that summarizes what's happening. And this can be generated by code. So if you're able to write code that can do that in your data app, then you can build these little things. It doesn't have to be fancy. It can just basically say everything is within range or whatever, and everything's green or whatever. And then if it's not, it can then specifically point out the things that aren't. And that can be helpful for people who just think more in terms of like a written sentence than numbers necessarily, or who don't know what to look for, because it can point them to the things that they should be looking at. And in the same vein, you want to highlight outliers or unexpected numbers. So if something is not in range, something is not the way it should be, then it should look different. It should have a different color. It should have something else, like a little exclamation point or whatever, that helps you, that helps make it stand out and tell people, hey, look here, there's something that's not as it should be. Even if you expect them to know the numbers, it's still helpful to have that to reinforce what's happening. And then the last point to this, which is sort of connected to this idea of quick use and getting a quick view of the data, is for it to be responsive and mobile friendly. So a lot of people will look at these things on their phones. They will just look at this quickly and see, oh yeah, this is what I need. I'm done. I don't need to even open this on my desktop. But so these things need to be, it's even more important for these things to be mobile friendly. And actually that also reinforces the idea that they shouldn't be overloaded with too much stuff, too much information. So with that, my next example, I'm not sure if that actually is mobile friendly or not, but this is another AWS example. This is my last one. I'm not going to have AWS examples through this whole thing, but I want to show this because I think it's instructive. And I do want to see if I can point here, but I don't seem to be able to. Oh, there we go. Okay, there's my mouse pointer. All right, so in the top left here, you can see the number. So there's a number here for spend. This is how much we spent last month. So if you're expecting to spend 20,000 and now you're spending 28,000, well, you might want to look into that. So these numbers are helpful to have up here. And then there's a few other things here about like the region and so on. But then also in the top right, I think is what they're doing here is the highlight, and this is a bit blurry, sorry, this is kind of a low-res screenshot, but they do tell you which things have changed the most. I'm not actually sure what the difference is between these two, but they show you what has the top movers, what has changed the most over the last month. And so I think that's an interesting way to just like highlight those things. And then there's a bunch of more charts that give you more information. I don't know what these are, to be honest, but the point is really this gives you the key information. I would even say that just this top section here would make a great overview dashboard, because this says, yeah, this is where we are, and it might even, again, if you can set like limits, we expect to spend 22,000 or whatever, I don't know, some number, and we're over that, well, then it might tell you, well, that, look at that, it's not what we expected. Or if it's a lot less, this could be another reason to look at it, because it's like, well, that's weird. We've always been spending this much, so why is it now different? So yeah, and then a good comment there from Tanya that I want to highlight here real quick, because so yeah, the colors are very on brand for AWS. not familiar with that. So, but yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I will talk about branding later too, because I think branding is very important. So having that as part of your design is definitely something you want to be thinking about. And then my other example here is going to be this one. This is from, this is also, I think, another example I'm going to come back to at the end when I talk about branding. But so this one is another user-facing dashboard. Actually, I'm not sure if this is user, sort of like end user versus like business users. But this is showing you information about your credit usage. And what I like about this is that it has these little sections. Again, I'm going to try and point here. There we go. It has these little sections, and each section shows you a number, right? So this is accounts paid on time, past due, whatever. But each of these has a little indicator that says good. So this is good. This is good for your credit score, or for your credit, whatever, as a business. I'm not sure exactly what this tells me, but and then there's one here that says review, which I'm not clear why you have to review the fact that you have 0 recently opened accounts. But either way, it's a good thing for that to point out that there's something that you should look at. There's something that's different. So having these little indicators, especially I kind of like that it actually also indicates when something is good, because very often you only point out the things that are bad. But it can be good to just say, well, yeah, this is nice. Things are going well. And so when this whole thing then turns orange or red, well, then it tells you need to look into these things a bit more. So I think this is a good one to, a good sort of like idea. Again, this is obviously something that's going to be very specific to the type of thing that you're going to show. Compare depending on what you're building. Right, and so then from here, we want to go deeper, of course. So we've started with the overview, but now we need to zoom and filter according to the quote, and then details on demand. So we want to provide more information. And this is where it gets harder to find good examples. But just talk a bit about what you can do is you want to provide more in-depth information, of course, and this means additional views, and I should have said additional pages here. So I'm thinking in terms of sort of like having an overview app, the whole thing is the app, I guess, but an overview page, an overview dashboard, and then going into the details. And actually, I'm going to go back here real quick to this example, because if you see these little carrots here on the side, these all are indicators that there's more information. So if I need more information, I can get that. And this gives me a hint that there's more information to be found. And so these little indicators are really helpful for that. And they can look, this is just one way of doing that. There are lots of ways of doing this. But I think this is a good way to separate this out into the overview and the details. And this is also where you want to add interaction. So when I'm going into the details, now I'm starting to filtering. I'm going to look at different data dimensions. I'm going to look at different time periods, this month versus last month, or year over year, things like that. And then also, because we have interaction, we want to coordinate between different views so that they all do the same thing. They all show you the same information. And then this becomes a more of a traditional it looks more like a traditional internal dashboard where you just have a lot of information. So this is something I tend to kind of rant on about quite a bit, which is that people like to overload dashboards with too much stuff, too many views, too much information, too many filters. And so this is where it becomes useful, because now you're building a data app that is supposed to do a lot. And so then you do want to do that. But that's why you have an overview dashboard that just shows you the key information first, and then you go into the more detailed one. And yeah, this is what I was talking about earlier. So multiple pages are a good way to organize things here. And then the last thing here that I really think I'm going to try and not rant about for too long, because at some point we're going to have to make another webinar about this, is to just be able to run models right there. And we're, of course, thinking about building data apps with code and dashboards with code. And so once you have code, you can build models right there, and they can run on your machine. There's no reason you have to pre-build models necessarily. I mean, it depends, of course, on how much data they depend on and whatever, but a lot of things can be done in the browser right there, because you can download the data into your app, and it's, even if it's a few thousand, a few million records that you need, that's not a problem anymore. And you can run models right there and give people interactive control of what they're seeing. So I think there's a lot of potential here that's not really being used nearly enough. So my example here for a detailed view is this Bloomberg view that has a lot of information around the central kind of chart that shows you stock prices. In this case, I think this is Google. But the idea is that you have not just the numbers, the data itself, but you have all kinds of additional data and in terms of numbers, but also in terms of the news that might be influencing the stock price, so that are like news about this company and like its industry and so on. So you get a lot of additional information. But of course, this also goes a little bit into this question of like, who are your users? Bloomberg is maybe a bit of an extreme example because you need to be well versed in what all you can actually see here and all the things that you can do to be able to make use of this kind of data app. But obviously, this is a good example of a data broker. I mean, that's what Bloomberg is all about, is that they have the data and they have ways of showing you that. And if you're trained in this space, you know what to do with that. I certainly don't. But it's a good example of like, this is where you will want a lot of detail. And my other example is a little bit less intense in terms of data, but it's showing a model, a very simple model, but I think it's a good example of how this can be used. So this is a retirement planner from a financial planning app. And I think this is called Personal Capital or Empower now. And the idea is that you have your savings starting at age 27 here, and you've got your savings, and they build up, and then at some point you retire. And then you're going to start... Sorry, I'm pointing at the wrong thing here. I should be pointing at this screen. So you're building up your savings, and then you start to draw from them. And then there are and this is a model that's based on your inputs. So you're going to put in information about like how much you're going to save per month, how much you're going to buy a house at some point, how much do you need money for that, and all kinds of things. And then in retirement, how much do you expect to spend? And then you maybe have to pay for your kids' education, things like that. So you can put information in here and you can change that. There's little pencils here. You can change these inputs into the model, and then the model will just rerun and will show you what that looks like based on your inputs. And that's a very quick way of just showing a model and having it run right there, because I believe this just runs in your browser, and it's easy enough to do that. Like, this is not hard to imagine building this kind of model that could just run right there and give you the information. Okay, I'm gonna look at this question real quick because I think this fits in context here. How do you think about the transition from the overview dash to the deeper view for the user? How would you encourage users? Interesting. How do you encourage users to find a deeper view and engage with it? Right. Or does the user need to have the intent in the first place? I think that's what I would expect. Yeah. So I would think that that's a deep question. Let me go back to my earlier example. Not this one, this one. So this one has these little indicators here to say there's more information, and also it has these little things that say, yeah, you should review this. My thinking is that as a user of this, the things that are good, I'm not going to look into because there's no need to. So I feel like this is, I don't want to spend time on things that I don't need to spend time on. So if it says this is all fine, everything's going well, then I'm going to be like, yeah, that's great. Why would I spend time on this? But I mean, I could still do it, but it's just, it doesn't seem necessary. But if there's something that says review this, or, problem, whatever, and there are these indicators that say, this is how you get to the information, then that's going to hopefully get your users to look into those things. So I think the intent has to be there that they will look at this, because otherwise, I don't think that they should be sort of like be forced to to look at things that aren't necessary. So I really feel like it's we want to save people's time as much as possible. But yeah, it's a good question. And I think in general, the more indicators you can give people that things aren't going well, the more they will want to find that information. And the easier ways, like having little arrows and things like that, little link indicators to say, here, this is where you find more information, would be a helpful thing to have. And then sort of in part of this whole question of having external users and having users who aren't using or aren't necessarily using your data app very intensely all the time is to give them context. And so context means, or like the question that I think you want to answer is, what am I looking at? What is it? And how do I understand what's going on here if I'm not a common, like using this all the time? So, and especially, of course, it's important for external users because they might not be familiar with your data, your terminology, and so on. Like maybe the way you use terms, it's just not the way they use it in their context usually. So this is just a thing that needs to be explained. And then they just might not be using your app that often. So maybe they just need it once a week. And so again, this is not a bad thing. I'm not saying that they're not using your app because it's a bad app. They're not using it that they don't need to use it a lot all the time. It's actually a good thing because it means you're doing a good job of not overloading them with information that you don't need. Or things are going well, right? So if things are going well, there's really no need to dive deeper. Usually, unless you're doing analysis for the sake of analysis. But if you're usually as an external user, what you're looking for are problems. And then, of course, you also want to avoid misunderstandings that lead to bad decisions. So if people misunderstand what's being shown, they might just do the wrong thing, and you don't want to mislead your users. So context can be lots of things, but again, text is really important. So labels, units should be on everything. This is probably a general rule that's always true, but every chart should have units. Every chart should have labels that explain or that tell you what the chart shows in enough detail so that you understand what's going on. And then again, I already talked about chart and section titles that just help you kind of understand what the context is. And those should be meaningful, not just like repeat what you can already see on the chart, but give you some idea of what you can understand or what you can get from that. And then there's more that you can add by just giving people more information in things like tooltips. When you mouse over something, it then has a little hovering thing that tells you something more about that. And there can be lots of information that you can add there. You don't want to overload it, and you want to do this sort of on demand as I'm hovering or as I'm looking at a detailed dashboard perhaps. But having that available is really important. And then in the same vein, having links to documentation. And if you're doing this in your browser, which I kind of assume everybody's doing, then you can just have a link. You can link to a wiki page. You can link to a documentation page and just have more information there that tells people what this is that they're looking at and what your definitions are and so on. And of course, it would always be nice to have a way to actually ask questions. This is easier to do within an organization, but your external users, if they can have a way to ask a question or request something, that's always going to be a good thing. And so my example here for context is a bit of a I guess unusual because this is a public-facing example, but this is done by folks at Climate Central. They have these urban hotspots. I just want to briefly show this here by sharing this tab here. All right. So this is a simple data. Well, it's a data app that's based on a lot of data, but as the app that you play with or that you look at, it's nice and straightforward. And what they do here is they talk about what this is. So it tells you that this is about the heats of islands within urban areas, not just urban areas. Actually, they have a whole map of the US there as well. And then they link to different information. So they tell you what the analysis are. They have some resources about more stuff about that you can click on. And then you get to the actual app. And then if I can, yeah, there you go. and then you can interact with that. So this shows you this heat index, or you can actually see that I can click and just pick a different city, but that's what I'm doing here. So I can pick different places and I can zoom and so on. So I can see the information. I can, and this is also a good example of just enough information to understand what's going on. So you can see where we are. You can see what this is. You can see the unit, and then for the colors, and then you can see what's going on here. And then there's also more information down here. So again, this has a link to an article that tells you what this is about. And there's also the whole US here. I should have loaded this earlier because there we go. So now I can then zoom in here and find a particular spot that I'm interested in. And again, everything is either described here or linked to from the app. Just taking a quick look here at the chat. All right. And then this has already come up, but yeah, branding and design are important, and especially in this case, and for a number of reasons. So there are obviously branding elements that you would use, that you would think about, like colors, backgrounds, logos, obviously, are things that are important for branding. And then you might have certain style guides for things like drop shadows and the kinds of layouts you use and so on. I mean, there's obviously a lot that goes into this. And so the reason this is important is not just because you want your brand to be represented correctly and properly, but from the perspective of the user, it's just helpful to know what they're looking at. So if you're using a certain kind of blue or whatever, or a certain kind of like color or something, you're a certain kind of layout, then people will just know that this is the thing that I'm expecting to look at, or this is that thing versus the other thing that I need to look at. So having a distinctive, clear branding isn't just about your own brand. It actually helps your users know what they are looking at. And again, this is something where your users might not be doing that all the time. So they might be they might just be doing it, like looking at your thing like once a week or whatever. And then it's more important even then that they know that this is what they're looking at, that they're looking at the correct thing that they're trying to find. And as for design, I already talked about the visual hierarchy. I think it's really important to think about that and have a clear idea of what that means and what the most important information is. And then also have responsive layout. So I talked about things being mobile friendly. So that's the same idea that you're able to respond to. That you're responding to screen sizes and so on. So this is part of design, of course, is that you're able to do that. I put this example here. I feel like I've shown this a bit too much, so I'm not going to delve on this or spend too much time on this, dwell on this. That's what I was trying to say. But obviously you can see logos here. You can see a certain layout. You can see design elements like drop shadows and colors and icons and so on that presumably are part of of the brand. I do want to show you one other example here, which is this was the responsiveness example. Yeah, so let me share this one. We'll see how well this works. But my point here is this is not so much about the design, but about about responsiveness. So this is a dashboard that shows you mortgage rates over a long period of time, from like the early 1970s to about, I think, the beginning of this year. And this is also interactive. Like you can move this and you can see that it then like shows you the zoomed in chart there at the top. But what I'm more interested in here in this example is the responsiveness. So I'm going to see how well this works here to resize this window. But when I do that here, if I can do this, there you go. So if I resize this, it responds to by resizing the charts, and then also by changing the layout. So you can see this here. So here I have these two cards that have numbers next to the chart, and when I make it a bit narrower, because maybe I'm on a phone, now this changes. So now I have the cards on top and then the charts stack below. And I think this even goes further, because if I make this even narrower, right? So now the two cards stack, and then the charts are on top of this. So now this will be more like a phone and view. And this is something you can do quite easily when you're using modern web technology, because there are lots of ways that help you with lots of things that help you with that. And that's always an important concern here. All right, and I'm going to quickly go through my last couple of slides here, because I'm actually way over the time that I was hoping to be in. The first one is about speed. So speed is really important to keep people on task. So if I'm going to just check out all my metrics in the morning, but I have to wait for a long time, well, I'm gonna just lose focus, and I'm gonna go somewhere else and forget that I wanted to do this thing. So it's important to keep things snappy, and also just it makes your product look bad. If your dashboards are slow, it makes you look bad. So speed is really, really crucial, not just as because it's important to keep you in the flow, but also just to not look like this is like your fault, even if it's not, because you're just using a product that's just slow. And people you shouldn't make your users wait for slow data sources or slow modeling. And so what we do at Observable, of course, is we have offline data loading and modeling in data loaders, and those help just make your load times much faster. So the way this works is that we have a machine somewhere, a server that builds your dashboards. I have this little sort of like walkthrough here. So it talks to your databases, it talks to files, and then it builds a package of data and anything you need to build from that. And this might take a long time, but it runs offline. And so when your user comes and wants to get to their dashboard, to their data app, all it has to do now is grab that prepared package and send it back to the user and get a much faster response than you would get if you have to do this whole spiel where as the person connects, now you start to talk to the database. Now you have to figure out what even is on your dashboard, load all the data, wait for the databases to come back, and so on. So this is a much faster way of doing that, and it feels much faster. It feels like a much more responsive way of doing things. And you can still access databases right there from the browser as well. And you can again do modeling in the browser and so on. So there's lots of ways you can do things when you're doing things using code. And then my last point here is about keeping data fresh. And this is obviously a thing where you always want to have your data be up to date, but the question is always how up to date should the data be? And I don't want to go into too much detail, because we have a blog post about this, and it's a little bit of a tangential point. But the thing is that people tend to think that your data always has to be up to date to the second. But that's actually a mistake, because often the meaningful changes in data aren't actually that fast anyway. And then if you're looking at data for incomplete time periods, like your week isn't over, your month isn't over, you're looking at, and especially if it's like additive numbers, like how much did we spend this month as we're in the month. So today is the 23rd. The month isn't over, so the number that we've spent so far doesn't represent the total spent for this month. So it's not a meaningful piece of information necessarily. It can be, but it doesn't. It often isn't. And so data just needs to be as recent as actually makes sense. And I think this is a mistake that a lot of people make, that they represent or that they show up to the second data, but people then misunderstand that, and there's a lot of churn in decision making that's not helpful, or people just totally do the wrong thing because they look at things that seem to be going down even though they're not. Right, so because you have to be careful with incomplete time periods. And of course, you also always want to show when the data was refreshed on the dashboard, so people know how current is this? Is this for this quarter? Is this the complete quarter? Things like that. So this information is really important. Again, this is a separate talk for a separate time. And so what we do, what we provide for that is cloud builds on Observable. So you can now build your data apps and have them be run on Observable directly, and just be and update automatically on a schedule. So you can just have that be done for you automatically. And this could be like once a day, once a week, whenever, whatever, however often you need for your specific data. And so to conclude, and then I'll get to a couple more questions. User-facing analytics are their own thing that is similar, but it's different from internal data apps because you know less about your users, because your users have a different usage pattern than internal users do. And so it's important to know those users' tasks and questions, and it's both important and harder when they're external users. And as I said, you want to start by giving them this quick overview because it's much more common for these users to not want to spend much time on this and just get a quick idea, but then have ways to get more information. They'll also provide more context because they're more infrequent users. They're more they're not as engaged necessarily with your app. So you want to help them to know what's going on and to know what they're looking at and get more information from right there or from linked sources. And then make your apps snappy and keep the data up to date. So this is obviously an important part of this as well. This is basically the final thing here. So I have a little blog post about this, and we have a few more on dashboard design and so on. So if you go to our blog, you can find more on that. And with that, I'm going to look at some more questions. Interesting. Okay, so how many of the examples you've shared, such as the one from Capital One of Bloomberg, can be implemented using the Observable HQ framework, including tabs, markers for more information? I would see all of these. So so in framework, there are. Let me see if I can find an example. So there's this one example that I didn't actually show, but I was going to show this. This is a sort of like just an example of a dashboard. This shows downloads for Observable Plot, our charting library. And you can see the big numbers, you can see charts and so on, but you can build whatever you want. You have layouts that are responsive. So what you just saw earlier too, when I resized this layout of the mortgage rates dashboard, that responsiveness is part of that. So you can build these things, any of those, because, and actually I'm going to bring up another quote here from Tanya here. CSS magic. So CSS cascading style sheets are exactly what make this happen, because there are, I mean, you still have to build it and make it, but there are tons of tools now that you can use that help you with layouts to make them responsive, to do the things that you want to have them look a certain way and so on, that are very, very powerful. And you can do anything you want in framework and in using Observable. Another question, any tips for creating feedback loops with these types of users? Interesting. Are there other ways like Google Analytics that you think are helpful? So that is a good question. I think one thing you could do that I mentioned earlier is to have ways for people to just be able to ask you questions or to make requests. The other thing could be I'm not sure how you would use Google Analytics for this. They would certainly help. Well, actually, we have analytics in Observable too. So you will see who's using your apps. And that I talked about this when I talked about dashboard design, is it's important to keep track of, is your thing actually, the data app that you're building, is that actually being used? Because if it's not being used, well, that's a bad sign. Something's wrong with it. You might want to then check in with your users. So that could be a helpful thing, that you use it and you look at the analytics and get a sense of like, well, this was used for a little while and then it just dropped off. But then you want to be able to get to your users and ask them. So maybe you have a little banner and say, well, talk to us about things that you like or dislike. Of course, that means that they actually have to go to your data app, because otherwise they're never going to see your banner. Yeah, that's a good question. It's hard with these apps to reach your users if they're not engaged. But yeah, just simply asking them for feedback can be very helpful, I think. And there's another question here. Can we integrate with front-end tech like React Next? Yes, you can do that. Certainly with React, not so much with Next, but you can build, you can actually, so this is observable framework. Framework uses JavaScript, but and you can also build like things with SQL directly. Like you can run SQL queries right as part of a code block, but you can also now just insert JSX React sort of code blocks in there as well, and they work just the same. So yeah, you can use React now in observable framework. All right. Well, we are way over time anyway, and I feel like I want to end this one on without going over again. So if there aren't any more questions, I thank you all for coming and for asking questions and commenting. And I encourage you to check out the our blog, and also we have our slides. So if Tom can post the link to the slides, so you can check those out. And then we obviously, there we go. So we've got the link to the slides there. Thanks, Tom. And we're always happy to hear from you what you thought about this webinar, if there are any topics you want to hear more about, and so on. So with that, thank you all, and I hope you have a great day.